Could I have the slide? Well, let's wait for a slide. Didn't make it. Technology? Since I'm starting my speech with some numbers, it would be good to have this slide. Maybe a few comments on my previous speakers. I was very pleased to see what Rebecca presented, because I thought to have a longer slideshow, and we would have doubled everything. I think the investment numbers we've seen are numbers not only in US studies appear, but they appear in almost every international OECD, whatever study, which is related to different investment levels of telcos in the world. And if you compare those levels also to Asia, it even gets worse. I mean, we have Asian numbers where the level of investment in the past 5 years went even higher. If you look at the reasons for that, there are, of course, inherent reasons at the company level, and that was my slide, which apparently got lost. So I read much of the numbers to you. If you compare, here we are, wow. If you look at this slide, what it shows to you is the fundamentals on a company level in comparison to the US in the past 10 years. And of course, EBIT, which is the measure in our, or KPI in our industry, you could also talk about profitability in a wider sense. If you look at the European development, the overarching finding of a study which was published 2 weeks ago by Accenture is that we lost almost 100 million euros per day to digital disruptors in Asia and Europe in the past 10 years. We are just losing. And if you then go into the details, in 2006 we had about 69 billion euros EBIT in the European telco sector. In 2016, 39. That's minus 44%. In 2006 we made about 63 billion EBIT. In 2016, we made 32 billion euros. So that's minus 49, almost half. In 2006, we made 30% of the worldwide telco EBIT. In 2016, only 9% left. And if you then look at the American side, the telco revenues rose from 30 to 55, plus 89%, so there was considerable growth in the US sector. And the American companies in the digital value chain, the OTTs, they grew like hell. I mean, this was one of the biggest growth stories we ever saw. In the last 10 years, they went up by 181%, up from 78 to 219 billion euros. And I think that's a very impressive figure, and there might be reasons for that. And when you look at the reasons, we heard from my predecessors, some of these reasons and value drivers might be connected to regulation. And I think Rebecca rightly started with access regulation. If you look at the developments in the US since 2003, it was, I think, 2003 that access regulation was mainly abolished. In Europe, at the same time, access regulation was widened. you can draw a direct line from this access regulation to investment. And if we now look at the investment levels in fiber to the home, how can an industry which went 49% down invest the levels needed for Europe? I mean, it's just a simple money question. And then you hear, as we heard in the introduction, Europe needs competition. We have a lot of competition. We have already, in almost every member state, 2 or 3 networks. So that level of competition is enough for a sustainable competitive environment. But nevertheless, what we get is more regulation. And I'm not repeating what Manuel has said now, but maybe some of the lowlights which will not lead to more investments need to be mentioned here. The first thing is the EU proposal, the original code, was not a bold step. Everybody expected a bold step towards investment incentives. What we got was a very complicated piece of law. We had, for example, 7 different definitions of competition, which is a bit difficult then if you want to regulate. And we had only a few exemptions where access regulation shouldn't take place. For example, cooperations between companies on the infrastructure level or a sole wholesale operator. If you look at the structure of the industry, this might not be directed at the main investors because the main investors are not working like that. So how do you incentivize investment? Question mark. What we've now seen in the parliament, it gets worse. We now have a regime which is not based on SMP regulation, and the cable operators will be part of the regulated game. So we, despite of existing infrastructure competition, we now have even the part which was not regulated being regulated. You may wonder, as an incumbent, I could say, hey, great, so we have them also in. I much more would like to have nobody regulated because we have existing infrastructure competition. On the spectrum side, and that is another very big chunk of investment, the European Commission made a bold move. They tried to expand spectrum licensing to 25 years. They tried to harmonize, and they tried to create a real common market for spectrum. And this attempt, unfortunately, as in previous attempt, got lost in the member states. And what we are now having is ideas of 10 years of licensing duration, which is, I would say, not a real incentive to invest in 5G, because once you have built the network, the license is over. So I'm not very positive about the future outlook if that stays as it is. And in addition, to make things not too long here and leave room for the discussion, we have an e-privacy directive. Remember, 3 years ago, we had a huge discussion about the European Channel Data Protection Directive. Regulation, not directive, sorry. The e-privacy at the time, when we asked as an industry, was considered as being something which goes away. And we were assured on all levels, don't worry, what is in place is a general framework. The regulation in place will deal with everything. Half a year later, regulation never dies. We got an e-privacy regulation draft. And this draft now regulates things like data location services for telcos in a different way. It does for OTTs. That's our view. OTTs have other problems with that. But the general feeling we have with this regulation is it is not meant to really stimulate data economy models. It's rather meant to stop them. And that will have a big impact on, if you look at this slide, on the OTT part. We will never come up with something which equals the US. And that's my biggest fear, that we even on that sector lose out because of new regulation. Thank you.